Pablo Escobar was 23 years old when he executed his first operation that required coordination across 3 countries, involved more than 50 people, and generated enough money to buy a small army. It was 1972, and what started as a simple cocaine smuggling run had evolved into something that American law enforcement had never encountered before, a criminal organization that operated with the precision of a corporation, the reach of a government, and the ruthlessness of a military force. When the operation was complete, Pablo had moved over 200 kilograms of cocaine into the United States, generated more than $10 million in profit, and proven that individual criminals could build networks powerful enough to challenge nation-states. This wasn't just crime anymore. This was the birth of modern organized crime, and it would eventually force America to completely rethink everything it thought it knew about fighting drugs. But what happened in 1972 was just the beginning of something that would terrorize 2 nations. But to understand how Pablo created the world's first truly international drug cartel, you have to understand that what he built wasn't based on family connections or ethnic loyalties or traditional criminal hierarchies. What Pablo built was based on something much more dangerous: scientific management applied to illegal activities. Pablo had studied how legitimate corporations operated, and he had decided that criminal organizations could be more efficient, more profitable, and more powerful than any legal business if they were managed with sufficient intelligence and systematic brutality. The transformation from individual smuggler to cartel leader didn't happen overnight. Pablo spent more than a year studying the logistics of large-scale cocaine trafficking, the psychology of organizational management, and the economics of systematic corruption. What he discovered revolutionized criminal enterprise in ways that law enforcement agencies are still trying to understand 50 years later. Pablo learned that criminal organizations failed not because they were discovered by authorities, but because they were managed poorly by criminals who didn't understand business principles. Pablo's approach to building a criminal organization was unlike anything that had existed before in Colombia or anywhere else. Instead of recruiting people based on personal relationships or neighborhood connections, Pablo recruited based on professional competence. Instead of operating in a single geographic area, Pablo designed systems that could function across multiple countries. Instead of focusing on individual crimes, Pablo created infrastructure that could support unlimited criminal activity. The first major smuggling operation revealed Pablo's genius for logistics and his understanding of how to minimize risk while maximizing scale. Traditional cocaine trafficking involved small quantities moved by individual couriers who hoped to avoid detection through luck and careful route planning. Pablo's operation involved massive quantities moved by coordinated teams who avoided detection through systematic corruption and professional execution. The operation began 6 months before any cocaine was actually moved. Pablo spent this time building what he called the infrastructure of inevitability. This meant identifying and corrupting officials at every stage of the smuggling route, establishing safe houses and communication networks in multiple cities, recruiting and training personnel for specialized functions, and creating contingency plans for every possible complication. Pablo's recruitment process was remarkably sophisticated for a criminal organization. Pablo understood that successful smuggling operations required people with different skills: chemists who understood cocaine production, pilots who could navigate international routes, mechanics who could modify aircraft and vehicles, accountants who could manage complex financial transactions, and enforcers who could maintain discipline and eliminate problems. Pablo was building a criminal corporation with specialized departments and professional standards. But Pablo's recruitment went beyond simply finding people with the right skills. Pablo developed psychological profiles for different types of positions, understanding that effective chemists needed different personality traits than effective enforcers, and that successful pilots required different motivations than successful accountants. Pablo was applying industrial psychology to criminal recruitment in ways that most legitimate businesses hadn't even discovered. The vetting process for new recruits was exhaustive and systematic. Pablo would spend weeks studying potential employees, learning about their families, their debts, their ambitions, and their weaknesses. Pablo understood that loyalty in a criminal organization couldn't be assumed. It had to be engineered through a combination of generous compensation, genuine care, and credible threats. Pablo established training programs for different roles within his organization that were more comprehensive than those offered by most legitimate employers. New recruits received education in their specific job functions, cross-training in related areas, and ongoing professional development that kept their skills current with changing technology and law enforcement techniques. Pablo was creating a workforce that was more competent and more committed than anything his competitors could field. The compensation structure that Pablo developed was designed to create long-term loyalty rather than short-term cooperation. Pablo paid his employees significantly more than they could earn in legitimate employment, but he also provided benefits that were tailored to their specific needs: medical care for family members, educational opportunities for children, legal protection when needed, and retirement planning that ensured long-term financial security. But Pablo also understood that effective management required more than just generous compensation. Pablo established clear hierarchies, defined responsibilities, and accountability systems that ensured everyone understood their role in the organization. Pablo was creating professional standards for criminal activity that made his organization more efficient and more reliable than anything law enforcement had encountered before. The cocaine production network that Pablo established was organized like an industrial manufacturing system. Pablo recruited chemists from legitimate pharmaceutical companies, equipped laboratories with industrial-grade equipment, and implemented quality control systems that were more rigorous than most legitimate businesses. Every batch was tested for purity and consistency. Products that didn't meet standards were destroyed. Pablo was creating cocaine that was superior to anything competitors could provide. But the genius wasn't just the production, it was what happened next. But the genius of Pablo's system wasn't just the production side. It was the integration of production with distribution, marketing, and financial services. Pablo understood that controlling every aspect of the cocaine trade, from cultivation to street sales, would give him advantages that no competitor could match. Pablo was building vertical integration in the drug trade before most legitimate businesses understood how to manage supply chains effectively. The transportation network that Pablo created became the template for international drug trafficking. Instead of relying on single routes, Pablo established multiple methods: aircraft, maritime vessels, and ground networks. Each had backup systems and different personnel. Pablo was operating what amounted to a private airline dedicated to drug trafficking. Then came the first major crisis. In October 1973, one of Pablo's primary aircraft, carrying 150 kilograms of cocaine, nearly crashed during a storm over the Caribbean. The pilot, a former military aviator, had to make an emergency landing on a remote airstrip while being pursued by what he thought were interdiction aircraft. For 6 hours, Pablo's entire leadership believed the operation was compromised and prepared to abandon their primary smuggling route, but the aircraft turned out to be commercial traffic, and the pilot had successfully evaded a catastrophe that could have destroyed everything Pablo had built. The near miss taught Pablo a crucial lesson. Even the most sophisticated operations could be destroyed by variables no one could control. Pablo began implementing redundancy systems that could survive not just law enforcement, but acts of God. Pablo's communication systems gave him real-time coordination across vast distances, but in January 1974, those same systems nearly betrayed him. A Colombian military unit intercepted radio communications that they couldn't decode, but the transmission patterns suggested a large-scale smuggling operation. For weeks, Pablo's organization operated in near-total communication blackout while they determined whether their codes had been broken. The investigation revealed that Pablo's network was secure, but the scare convinced him that even encrypted communications could be detected. This was when Pablo realized that superior technology wasn't enough. He needed superior intelligence. The corruption network that supported this operation was unprecedented in its scope. Pablo wasn't just bribing officials when problems arose. He was building long-term relationships with government employees at every level. Pablo studied organizational charts, learned bureaucratic procedures, and recruited informants who provided advance warning of enforcement activities. But corruption had its own dangers. In early 1974, a Colombian customs official who had been on Pablo's payroll for 6 months was transferred to a position where he could no longer help. Worse, his replacement was a recent graduate who arrived determined to clean up what everyone knew was a corrupt department. For 2 weeks, Pablo's most important smuggling route was completely vulnerable. The new official began investigating irregularities in cargo manifests that could have exposed Pablo's entire operation. Pablo's solution revealed both his sophistication and his ruthlessness. Instead of eliminating the honest official, Pablo arranged for him to be promoted to a position in Bogotá where he could do more good for his career and less damage to Pablo's business. The promotion came with a salary increase that was funded by Pablo through a shell company. The official never knew that his career advancement had been purchased by the criminal he had been trying to catch. This incident taught Pablo that corruption wasn't just about buying officials, it was about managing their careers, their families, and their futures. Pablo began thinking about corruption as human resource management applied to government employees. But perhaps most importantly, Pablo was learning to use violence strategically rather than reactively. Violence in Pablo's organization wasn't a response to problems. It was a management tool for preventing problems from developing. Pablo established clear protocols for when violence should be used, who should authorize it, and how it should be implemented to achieve maximum psychological impact with minimum operational disruption. And this would soon become his most feared capability. The violence protocols that Pablo established were based on systematic analysis of psychological impact rather than emotional response. Pablo studied how different types of violence affected different audiences, learning that strategic brutality could achieve results that conventional threats couldn't accomplish. Pablo was weaponizing fear with scientific precision. Pablo's understanding of violence as communication was remarkably sophisticated. Pablo recognized that every act of violence sent messages not just to the immediate target, but to everyone who heard about it. Pablo began designing violent acts specifically for their communicative value, creating methods of elimination that would be remembered and discussed long after they occurred. The enforcement structure that Pablo created was organized like a military unit with clear chains of command, defined responsibilities, and professional standards. Pablo's enforcers weren't just street criminals who used violence impulsively. They were trained professionals who understood how to apply violence systematically to achieve specific organizational objectives. The financial systems that Pablo created were more sophisticated than those used by most legitimate businesses. Pablo established money laundering networks that could process millions of dollars, created accounting systems that tracked complex international transactions, and developed investment strategies that converted illegal profits into legitimate assets. Pablo's organization was generating so much cash that he had to establish specialized counting houses and storage facilities just to manage the physical currency. Pablo was solving logistical problems that legitimate businesses never had to address. Pablo's understanding of American drug markets was remarkably advanced for someone who had never lived in the United States. Pablo studied American consumer behavior, price sensitivity, and distribution patterns with the systematic attention that legitimate businesses applied to market research. Pablo understood that success in the American cocaine market required not just supplying a product, but creating demand for that product, and he was about to prove it in ways that would change America forever. The marketing insights that Pablo developed during this period would eventually revolutionize illegal drug sales. Pablo recognized that cocaine users weren't just buying a chemical substance. They were buying status, confidence, and identity. Pablo began to think about cocaine distribution as brand management with quality control, customer service, and market positioning strategies that legitimate businesses would have envied. Pablo also understood that sustainable success in the American market required building relationships with American partners who understood local conditions, legal systems, and law enforcement practices. Pablo established partnerships with American distributors who could provide market intelligence, handle local operations, and manage relationships with customers that Pablo couldn't supervise directly. But the most innovative aspect of Pablo's first major operation was his use of technology and communication systems that were ahead of their time. Pablo established encrypted communication networks that allowed coordination across vast distances, used electronic surveillance equipment to monitor law enforcement activities, and employed counter-surveillance techniques to protect his operations from detection. The psychological impact of this first major operation on Pablo cannot be overstated. The success proved that Pablo's theories about criminal organization were correct, that systematic approaches to illegal activity could generate extraordinary profits, and that properly managed criminal enterprises could operate on scales that rivaled legitimate corporations. Pablo was learning that crime could be industrialized. American law enforcement in the early 1970s was completely unprepared for what Pablo was creating. Traditional investigations assumed criminal organizations were small, local, and simple. Pablo was building something that operated like a multinational corporation with the resources to corrupt officials, intelligence capabilities that exceeded most government agencies, and violence potential that could eliminate threats. The DEA's early encounters with Pablo's organization revealed a devastating truth. American agencies were facing an enemy that was better funded, better organized, and more technologically advanced than they were. Pablo could afford to pay informants more than law enforcement could pay their own personnel. Pablo's encrypted communication systems were superior to those used by most government agencies. Pablo's intelligence network provided better information about American law enforcement than American agencies had about Pablo. The hunters had become the hunted, and most American officials didn't even realize it yet. But perhaps most significantly, Pablo's success demonstrated that criminal organizations with sufficient resources could operate more efficiently than law enforcement agencies. Pablo's intelligence network provided better information about law enforcement activities than law enforcement had about Pablo's activities. Pablo's financial resources allowed him to corrupt officials faster than those officials could be replaced. Pablo's violence capabilities allowed him to eliminate threats more quickly than new threats could develop. The success of this first major operation convinced Pablo that he had discovered something more valuable than a profitable business model. Pablo had discovered a method for accumulating power that could eventually challenge the authority of governments themselves. Pablo was learning that crime wasn't just about making money. Crime was about building alternative systems of authority that could compete with legitimate institutions. The organizational structure that emerged from this operation became the foundation for what would eventually become the Medellín Cartel. Pablo had proven that criminal enterprises could be managed systematically, scaled internationally, and operated with levels of sophistication that surpassed most legitimate businesses. Pablo was transforming from a successful criminal into something much more dangerous, a criminal entrepreneur who understood how to build institutions. But the transformation went beyond organizational capability. Pablo was developing a worldview that would eventually bring him into direct conflict with the governments of Colombia and the United States. Pablo was learning that legitimate authority was simply one form of power among many, and that criminal organizations with sufficient resources could create their own forms of authority that were more effective than those provided by governments. Pablo's understanding of power dynamics was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Pablo recognized that power wasn't just about controlling people through fear or money. Real power came from making yourself indispensable to the people you claim to lead, from providing services that legitimate institutions couldn't or wouldn't provide, and from building loyalty that survived challenges, setbacks, and external pressures. The management philosophy that Pablo developed during this period was based on principles that legitimate business schools would have recognized as advanced organizational theory. Pablo understood the importance of clear communication, defined responsibilities, performance-based compensation, and strategic planning. But Pablo applied these principles in ways that legitimate businesses couldn't, using violence, corruption, and illegal activity as management tools. Pablo was also developing an understanding of leadership that went beyond simple command and control. Pablo learned to inspire genuine loyalty among his followers by demonstrating personal courage, sharing risks and rewards equitably, and maintaining personal relationships with people at every level of his organization. Pablo was becoming not just a criminal boss, but a charismatic leader who commanded respect as well as fear. The psychological impact of leading a successful criminal organization was profound for Pablo. Pablo was developing a sense of destiny that convinced him he was meant for greatness that transcended conventional categories of legal and illegal activity. Pablo was beginning to see himself not as a criminal who happened to be successful, but as a visionary leader who happened to operate outside the law. Pablo's success was also creating a feedback loop that reinforced his belief in his own capabilities. Every successful operation proved that Pablo's methods were superior to those of his competitors and the authorities trying to stop him. Every challenge that Pablo overcame convinced him that he was capable of overcoming any obstacle that might arise in the future. Pablo's success was also creating ripple effects throughout Colombian society that would have consequences for decades. Other criminals began copying Pablo's methods. Corruption that had once been exceptional became routine, and violence that had once been shocking became normal. Pablo wasn't just building a criminal organization. Pablo was changing the rules that governed how crime operated in Colombia. The money generated from this operation gave Pablo resources that transformed his relationship with Colombian society. Pablo was no longer just another criminal who had to hide from authorities. Pablo was becoming a power center that authorities had to negotiate with. Pablo was learning that sufficient wealth could convert illegal activity into legitimate influence. But Pablo was also learning that success in criminal enterprise created new categories of problems that required new categories of solutions. Competitors who wanted to challenge Pablo's dominance, government officials who couldn't be corrupted, and law enforcement agencies that were becoming more sophisticated in their investigative techniques. Pablo was discovering that building a criminal empire required not just offensive capabilities, but defensive strategies that could protect against increasingly dangerous threats. The psychological transformation that accompanied Pablo's first major success was profound. Pablo was developing a sense of invulnerability that bordered on megalomania, but it was invulnerability based on demonstrated capability rather than wishful thinking. Pablo had proven that systematic criminal organization could achieve results that individual criminal activity could never accomplish. By 1975, Pablo Escobar had transformed from a successful drug dealer into something the world had never seen. The leader of a criminal organization that operated like a government, thought like a corporation, and killed like an army. The techniques Pablo had developed would soon be applied to operations that would challenge two of the most powerful governments in the world. But success was creating new enemies. Competitors were recognizing Pablo as a threat. Government officials were understanding that Pablo was building power that could challenge their authority. American law enforcement was realizing they were confronting something unprecedented. Pablo's sense of invulnerability was justified by his success, but it was also creating blind spots that his enemies would eventually exploit. The money Pablo was generating was becoming so enormous that it created problems no criminal had ever faced. Pablo was making more money than he could spend, count, or launder safely. He was discovering that unlimited wealth created new categories of vulnerability. But perhaps most dangerously, Pablo was beginning to enjoy the process of accumulating power more than the benefits it provided. Building a criminal empire was becoming an addiction. And in our next episode, we'll see how Pablo transformed this successful operation into the Medellín Cartel, established dominance over all cocaine trafficking in Colombia, and began the war against authorities that would force the United States to intervene directly. We'll witness Pablo's transition from criminal entrepreneur to de facto head of state and see how one man's unlimited ambition threatened the stability of two nations. Subscribe now, because what happens next shows how a criminal organization becomes a threat that governments struggle to contain.